Hi, I'm Evelyn Farkas, the Executive Director of the McCain Institute. We are convened here today for the 40-something, we've done about 40 of these Authors and Insights, which are opportunities to sit down with authors to talk about timely issues. Today's topic and today's book is called The Big Truth, subtitle Upholding Democracy in the Age of the Big Lie. Now, this book was written by these two gentlemen here. We are very lucky to have with us CBS's chief Washington correspondent, Major Garrett, and with him is David Becker, who is one of our nation's foremost experts on elections. Together, these two gentlemen watched 2020 elections in alarm and decided to write a book. I will ask you guys about that in a second. But what I want to note today, on January 9th, as we are sitting here to do this interview, is that this book, although it was written in 2022, is incredibly timely. Now, we have recently learned that the book has come out in paper book, so you don't have to buy it in hardcover. If you feel like you like a lighter book, you can buy it in paperback. Why? Why is this so timely? Because right now, it's sort of simultaneously, actually, we have the President of the United States in DC's Court of Appeals, sitting there listening to an argument about whether he should have immunity for actions that he took, things that he said in the 2020 elections. So we'll talk about that. The other fact of the matter is, again, January 9th is today. January 6th, we just had the anniversary of the insurrection, the attempted coup, the attempt to, for the first time ever in our nation's history, stop the peaceful transfer of power. And we can argue that the transfer of power did not occur peacefully. People were hurt on that day, and the transfer occurred, but not peacefully. That's enough from me. I want to say thank you so much to both of you gentlemen for making the time to speak with us today. I really hope that people tune in, not just now, but subsequently you recommend it to your family and friends, because it is important for people to understand that while our former President Donald Trump and many of his supporters are running around still talking about a big lie, which was what actually happened in the 2020 elections, you guys came up with a way to present the real big truth. Mm-hmm. So if I could, I'll start with you, Garrett, Major, rather, sure. and then go to David. Yeah. If you could talk about sort of what led you as a journalist mm-hmm. to say, my God, I've got to sit down with one of our biggest experts on elections and write a book.
So I've been covering presidential politics, quite fortunately. It was a dream of my life to be able to do that since 1992. And Evelyn, every election year, starting in 1992, when it was my job to cover a presidential campaign, I took that day for granted. I took for granted the process by which hundreds of thousands of Americans, some of them employees, civil servants, some of them volunteers, do the work of allowing people to come to the polls, orderly, legally, coherently cast their ballots, collect those ballots, precinct by precinct, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city, county by county, process them, and then deliver a verdict to the country. It was always the quietest day of the campaign. The candidates have nothing to do, right. The pollsters have nothing to do, the speechwriters have nothing to do. Everyone waits. And I took that silent period for granted until 2020, when that process, placed under more pressure than ever since the Civil War, a global pandemic with no vaccines, the imperative of social distancing, all of the calibrations and adjustments that had to be made to hold an election were carried out. We had the highest turnout ever, the most diverse populace ever to participate in a presidential election in our history, meaning those things are signs of success, not failure. We had this radiant example of participatory democracy that was immediately and caustically slandered by the sitting president of the United States. And I didn't want to talk about the lie. I wanted to talk about the fundamental truth, the truth of what happened, and how it is a story of American ingenuity, cooperation, collaboration, inventiveness, all the things that I grew up understanding were unique about this country. Memorable, important, bipartisan values. We did all of that. Forget the result. I'm not about the result. I'm about what happened.
Right.
And that truth is something that David and I through conversations, wanted to have on the bookshelves forever. What happened?
Right.
Why it's the truth, and why the truth will outlive the lie. Don't ever doubt that. The truth about the 2020 election will never move. The slanders about it keep evolving, keep changing. The frame keeps moving around, but the fundamental facts will never move. That's why we called it the big truth.
Well, David, so I sort of have the same question for you, but since you really are the expert on the minutia, on the details, and I will, full disclosure, I actually ran in a Democratic primary in New York in 2020. So I definitely remember trying to get my 80-year-old mother to stop trying to collect signatures with pens that we thought were contaminated, and a lot of fear about turnout and having to get mail-in votes, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what's the good news? Because this big truth, it's not just big, it's actually really, really good, as you guys elaborate in the book.
Yeah, well, and first of all, thank you for inviting us here, Evelyn. I've been so appreciative. I'm honored to be here. I'm so appreciative of the work of Senator McCain and the McCain Center over the years to promote democracy. I've been doing this for about 25 years now. I used to be a lawyer with the Justice Department enforcing voting rights around the country. I now run a nonprofit in democracy called the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and still work in this space. And one of the key things that we do is we work with election officials. These people who used to be somewhat anonymous and who just did the quiet but incredibly important work of making sure that every American had a voice whenever we had an election, and then those elections would stand up to scrutiny no matter what. And we, as Major said, even I, who've worked in the space, we'd somewhat take that for granted, even though we'd slowly improve that over time. And in 2020, I can tell you I was working closely with election officials all over the country, and they were under, as you can imagine, incredible strain. While some people could go to work remotely, some children could attend school remotely, you can't run elections socially distant. You have to be around people. You have to take physical custody of ballots and machinery and other things. And during COVID, and again, putting us back to November of 2020, we forget often that we didn't fully understand COVID. We forget how many people we knew were getting really, really sick. We had no vaccines to rely upon at the time. We didn't even fully understand how it was transmitted. And election officials all over the country, nevertheless.
That's why I said the pens.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
I thought it was touch, but keep going.
And no, and that's exactly right. They had all these expenses they didn't have before. They had to buy special clothing for people. They had to buy extra pens. They had to buy plexiglass shields. All of these things they had no budget for. They had to inform voters about how to navigate elections during this difficult time. Polling places had changed. Opportunities for mail voting were much more in demand. People had to understand that a lot of people hadn't voted by mail before. And so it was really challenging. And at the end of all of that, they somehow managed the highest turnout of an election in American history by a large margin. 2/3 of all eligible voters in the United States turnout, it's the highest percentage ever. And 20 million more ballots were cast in 2020 than in any election in American history still to this day. And that election, in being held with the highest turnout ever in the middle of a global pandemic where they and their staffs were getting sick, subsequently withstood the most scrutiny an election has ever had to withstand. And their reward for that has been over 3 years of nonstop abuse, threats, and harassment. It breaks my heart. Major and I often talk about this. We should have thrown them a parade, and instead, they're under the kind of stress we can't possibly imagine. And yet even then, even despite that, think about the 2022 election and even the off-year elections, 21 and 23. They all went off very, very smoothly with very few problems. They are still, these civil servants, these anonymous public servants who are not getting rich and famous, are still doing the work every single day. I have every confidence they're going to do that in 2024. But at the time we wrote the book, and even more so today, I think it's safe to say Major and I felt we needed to write this book to tell the positive story, as you put it. It's a really positive story of this great American achievement, not from the perspective of who won the election, but from the perspective of making sure American citizens had a voice.
They didn't ask for a parade.
Yeah, no.
They deserve one, but they didn't ask for one. They will never ask for a parade. They just want to live in peace to do their job.
Well,
And they deserve that space.
Yeah. You see the women, the Georgia women, Ruby, I forget the
Ruby
name.
Freeman and
Ruby
Shay Moss.
Freeman.
Yeah. I mean, the mother, I think she was Shay Moss, right? The mother. Ruby asked her mom, "We need people. Can you just come and help out?"
Right.
And now they're of course they've been vilified and they're suing.
Their lives were
successfully.
ruined. I mean, they were doing their job late at night on election night, continuing the process of counting ballots, shown clearly on video that anyone could watch. And then what were dedicated public servants working, people lied about. And those lies caught fire. They were spread by the losing candidate himself and by those in his circle, and their lives were ruined. They went into hiding.
And many of them include, of course, Republicans like Bill Gates from Arizona. He was the Secretary of State who was in charge of the elections. And the Washington Post did a piece on
Maricopa County supervisor. I've gotten to know Bill quite well. Arizona was able to withstand this onslaught against democracy because there were many Republicans, unlike in some other states, but there were many Republicans, people who had voted for Trump, who stood up for the principles of democracy once the lies started. And Bill Gates was one of them, as were his colleagues on the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors. The person who won the recorder's race in Maricopa County that year is a Republican, Stephen Richer, who's done a remarkable job. And even though he didn't run that election, he has stood up for its authenticity. And the person who he beat, Adrian Fontes, a Democrat, subsequently won the Secretary of State's race and stood up for the authenticity of an election that he lost. The Speaker of the House, Rusty Bowers at the time, who was given an award by President Biden because he just stood up for democratic principles, which we used to take for granted, as Major said. The idea that you would lie or create an environment that would incite violence because your candidate lost an election that was verified and certified and reviewed by courts multiple times, that used to be something we couldn't even comprehend.
Let me give you one example of what I mean about ingenuity, collaboration, inventiveness. In that late spring and summer of 2020, when COVID was running rampant across our country, remember, you can't plan an election the day before an election. You have to plan months and months and months in advance under the most placid circumstances. These were not placid circumstances. And one of the biggest problems that election administrators faced all across the country was the cohort of poll workers tended to trend elderly.
Right.
50, 60,
Sure.
70.
I think everyone who's voted can relate to that. Yeah.
And who was the most vulnerable population? The population most warned about close contact, any kind of physical vulnerability you might have that would make you more susceptible. So about 400,000 of those Americans who had historically been poll workers, understandably, logically, under medical advice, opted out. So this country trained over Zoom in almost every instance, 400,000 new poll workers.
Wow.
Over Zoom. And working in a polling precinct is a tactile, physical, organized thing. Learning your orientation is helped enormously by being present.
Yeah.
You couldn't learn until you got there. So this was an exquisite example of Americans facing a huge problem, solving it with new people coming in, new technology, new adaptations, all under super high pressure. You can't spend 6 months training. You have to do it really quickly. An imperative existed. We rose to the challenge. It happened. That's really great. It's not a topic to slander. And I want to make something very, very clear, because there is this notion that still somehow permeates that David and I want to shut down anyone who asks a question. I don't want to shut down anyone who asks a question. Ask a question. But once it's answered, once it's answered in court, and evidence is laid before the process, accept the answer. That is your obligation as an American, to allow our process to continue. Ask questions. Ask 100 questions. Have the evidence tested. But once it has been tested, do not cling, and especially don't cling in violent ways to your dissatisfaction over the answer you got.
Right.
And I'll just add, the book is designed to answer a lot of those questions.
And
We
I
have
want
the
to
answers
actually
now.
ask you if you could, because you answer all these questions about, whether the Venezuelans got into machines and, where the machines connected to the internet, and you talk about paper ballots. And so since you're better at explaining this than anyone else, both of you, but I'll ask David this question. Can you just quickly debunk for us the big lie?
Sure. So first of all, I say often, and it's 100% true, the 2020 election was the most secure, transparent, and verified presidential election we've ever held. And 2024 will likely be even more secure, transparent, and verified because we continue to improve. But what we know about 2020 objectively is that we had more paper ballots than ever before since computers were introduced into the process. 95% of all voters voted on paper ballots, which are auditable and recountable. That's opposed to 75 to 80% in 2016. So it was much more. The entire state of Georgia had no paper. Most of the state of North Carolina and Pennsylvania had no paper in 2016. There was no way to audit and recount those ballots. And then in 2020, not only did we have the paper that we could audit in Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and in fact, in every single battleground state had paper, 100%. They did audit it. And they confirmed that what that audit does is the audit says, okay, we've got these machine counts, but we're not going to trust them. So we're going to take a lot of these ballots and we're going to check them by hand. And we're going to make sure that the hand counts of those ballots, the samples that we look at, match the machine counts. And if they don't, we're going to keep counting by hand.
Right.
And they did that in all the states. We all remember Georgia counted all of their presidential ballots 3 times, 3 different ways before the Electoral College met. And all of them confirmed the result that President Biden won in Georgia in that year. And then we also know the courts reviewed everything that was going on. One of the things we often hear from people who would try to delegitimize the 2020 election, and in fact, we heard it from congressional leadership just this past weekend, was, oh, all these states unconstitutionally changed the rules. And so the election was unconstitutional because they changed the rules. There were rule changes in some states as accommodations to COVID. Every single one of them was done transparently. If someone didn't like them, they were all brought to court. Every single one of them. And in fact, Republicans and Trump-associated plaintiffs won 7 out of every 8 cases that was brought pre-election. The most famous probably were that the state of Ohio and the state of Texas limited drop boxes where elections or ballots could be dropped off to only 1 per county, even if those counties were huge, like Harris County, where Houston is. And plaintiffs brought a case against them saying that's not fair. Harris County should have far more drop boxes. And the Texas court said, no, that's fair under Texas law. And those were the rules. Nobody liked all the rules of the election by the time election day came, but we all knew what the rules were, and we played by those rules.
Right.
And then subsequently, after the election, we know famously that there were over 60 cases tried before the Electoral College met. And all of them, or I'm sorry, none of them found anything that would have changed the result. And in fact, rarely was evidence even produced. We sit here today, well over 1,000 days since that 2020 election, well over 3 years since that election. There have been literally hundreds of opportunities for those who have alleged fraud to bring that to a court and say, I'm not going to put this on social media. I'm going to give this to a court. And I'm going to ask a court to look at it, and I'm going to subject it to scrutiny and cross-examination, and I'm going to let the other side look at it and do the same. They have not presented one single shred of evidence to any court, even though they had a huge incentive to. Rudy Giuliani could have brought evidence to his defamation trial and said the election really was stolen. He refused. Sidney Powell, there was a case brought against her in Michigan, and rather than for defamation, and rather than say, oh no, what I was saying was true, she said no reasonable person could have thought that what I was saying was true. There are cases ongoing all over the country, Fox News versus Dominion Voting Systems, others, where there could have been evidence brought, and they failed every time or absolutely refused to show evidence and instead go onto social media with something rather than have someone subjected to scrutiny in court. We sit here today, and that election still withstood all of that scrutiny. It's an incredible accomplishment for the men and women who did that, who ran elections all over the country.
So before we move into the present and the future, if I could just ask you, Major, because there was one point that you also made in the book, in the recount world, it was a landslide. So if you could just make that,
Right.
include that comparison as well.
Right. So people may look at an election result in a state like Georgia, say, wow, 11,000, that seems kind of close. Or 10,000, that seems kind of close. And in a certain way, it is close, 10th of a percentage. But in recounting, and on our history of recounting in this country, any election, member of Congress, Senate, governor, it's not close.
Mm-hmm.
There has never in our history, ever, been a race in which the margin was 1,000 or more, in which a recount overturned the result. Never.
Right.
Yeah,
And there have been hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And to just put this in, let us say, Republican Party context, when David McCormick, who was running for the Republican nomination for the United States Senate in Pennsylvania, finished about 1,000 votes behind Mehmet Oz, he thought about going for a recount, but then he looked at it and said, I'm not going to win. It's not going to happen. Because he knows what the history is. He knows that you're not going to find enough questionable ballots to close a gap of 1,000. You're just not. So if you're not at 1,000 and you're thinking 11,000 or 10,500 is really close, actually in recount history, it's as good as a landslide.
Yeah,
Right.
and for
It
election
doesn't
lawyers,
look like it, and
Yeah.
I understand
Yeah.
why it doesn't look
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to tell people to disbelieve their eyes. I'm just trying to let them understand, for the people who are most interested in this particular question, meaning candidates who are trying to
Yeah.
either protect their
Yeah.
job or
Yeah.
obtain a job
Yeah.
and advance their career in this chosen field, so the stakes could not be higher. They know what the truth is. And 1,000 is the outer edge, the outermost edge of believability in a recount conversation.
I mean, for election lawyers like me, that's kind of 1,000 is just kind of an easy place to pen it, but it's actually less than that in most cases. If you look at statewide recounts that were really close, where there were legitimate election administration issues, you look at the Washington gubernatorial election in 2004, the Minnesota Senate race between Franken and Coleman in 2008, where Franken wasn't actually, because of litigation, seated until the summer of 2009, right? Of course, Bush versus Gore, 537 votes in Florida in 2000. Those are close. And in Florida, that's not the outer edge, but there were legitimate election administration issues with the Chads and other things, which we don't have anymore, thank God. But those are where you could have a legitimate litigation trying to resolve that. Bush versus Gore is really instructive. I worked very closely with Ben Ginsberg, who was the Republican lawyer, one of the Republican lawyers in that. And they, both sides were well represented. Both sides brought legitimate legal arguments, and they fought it out in court with as much evidence as they had. And when ultimately a decision was made, half the country, in fact, maybe slightly more than half, given where the popular vote was, were unhappy with that decision. And that's understandable. I mean, you can absolutely be unhappy and disappointed with the results of a presidential election. That is 100% legit. But importantly, Vice President Gore accepted those results. He knew he had nowhere else to go. He didn't think, oh, what if I incite a mob?
Right.
What if I try to find a constitutional cheat code to undermine the electoral count, which I will preside over as vice president? Both he and Vice President Nixon in 1960 did the same exact thing. They accepted the results of a close election, and they fought to the next campaign if that's what they chose to do. And ultimately, of course, Vice President Nixon did win the presidency.
Okay, so now we're running short on time, but I wanted you guys to go through the explanation of what the big truth is, because I think it doesn't get enough airtime, if you will. But I think the number one thing anyone tuning in today is thinking is, oh my God, you guys say at the beginning of this book that you're afraid of civil war, you're afraid of a divorce, you're afraid for our democracy. So I don't know what the number was on a scale of 1 to 10 when you wrote the book, but if I can ask you what your number is now, And then, of course, to speed ahead, how are we doing? You wrote this book. It was not yet the midterm elections in 2022. We held those elections. We also passed a big law in the Senate, and actually through the entire Congress, making it clear that the vice president was just doing a ceremonial ticking the box on January 6th. Which I think most constitutional scholars consider a positive, improvement on our democracy. But if you guys could talk a little bit about, each of you, what you think is, how fearful you are, and what you think we really should focus on as voters. Obviously, the McCain Institute, our mission is defending democracy, human rights, and creating character-driven leaders. So, what can nonprofits do? That's a lot to roll into one question, but give it a try.
I'm going to defer to David on the Electoral Reform Act, but I will say on the Civil War. So we opened the book, and we did it with great caution. And David and I debated that opening probably more than anything in the book, because we didn't want to be inflammatory, but we couldn't ignore the underlying pressure points that we felt in the country, that states could just decide to pull away from one another over any number of issues, but an election could be one of them. And just stop recognizing each other. Saying, our place is red, your place is blue. You're so blue, you're unrecognizable to our redness, and we're just going to pull away from each other. Not with bullets and a bayonet, but with pieces of paper. Just withdraw, just pull away. I think those possibilities are just as present now as they were when we wrote that in the spring of 2022. Right. The book closed in late spring of 2022. We couldn't change anything more. So that's an early spring
maybe
2022.
Need a sequel.
Yeah. We'd love the opportunity to do that. In a most recent CBS News poll, we asked a very simple question. In the next presidential election, do you think the result will be accepted peacefully or reacted to violently? 51% in our poll said accepted peacefully. 49% said opposed violently. What does that tell you?
Yeah.
What does that tell you about this nation's sense of trauma and anticipatory dread about the next president of the United States? So you can't turn away from that. As a journalist, I have to understand those sentiments, report on them, and not turn away from them. But I'm also obligated not to inflame them. We're not trying to inflame, we're trying to warn. Bad things can happen. And if you are so fixated on elections not as a method to confer authority, but to validate your passions, right, we're in a dangerous place.
Yeah, it's easy to be pessimistic sometimes. We sit here with the former president in a courtroom about a mile away. Yeah. He is arguing that presidents are essentially kings and not subject to criminal prosecution or criminal responsibility for any of their acts. He still, and those surrounding him, are actively seeking to turn their supporters against their fellow citizens, to see them as enemies, to see them as the other, rather than bind us all together under a common vision, much as Senator McCain always embraced. And we see the polls that show it's a really closely divided nation, and we hear him repeatedly say what he would do if he took office again, which would be destroy all of the constitutional guardrails that we've enjoyed for nearly 250 years. And so that's the pessimistic side. But there is reason for optimism. As you noted, 2022 happened since we wrote the book. We were very worried what might happen, but in every contested race where there was someone who would embrace the lies about the election, running on those lies as a feature of their campaign, nearly every one of those people lost. And in fact, it was likely, they were all Republicans in this case, but if it was likely that if Republicans had chosen to run other candidates, more mainstream conservative candidates, they would have won those races in places like Arizona and Nevada. And I think, you look like someone like Governor Lombardo in Nevada, who didn't embrace the lies about the election, ran as a pretty standard conservative Republican. He won fairly comfortably when all the other seats went to Democrats in that election. So that was a positive. The voters of this country rejected that kind of anti-democratic behavior. and I remain somewhat optimistic that they will continue to do so. And secondly, you mentioned the Electoral Count Reform Act, and the fact that Congress passed that during the lame duck session in 2022 is really important. It strengthens the guardrails around the electoral count. It makes clear that it's simply a ministerial act. They're just counting votes that we already know exist. On January 6th, the vice president, we talk about him, serving a ministerial role. I kind of think of him as the MC. He's, the MC at the Oscars doesn't get to pick Best Picture,
Right.
but he is conducting what happens. And so that's all that happens. And it even raises some of the thresholds. More members of Congress, 20% in each house, have to object to a state in order for it to go to deliberations. They limit the grounds for those objections substantially. So there's a lot of good that came out of it. That doesn't mean that we're out of the woods. There are unscrupulous members of Congress, unscrupulous losing candidates, people who don't tether themselves to the Constitution, could still do a lot of damage and incite violence.
Real quickly, on the optimistic side, in 2023,
Yes,
Brandon Presley, Democrat, ran and lost in Mississippi for governor.
that's right.
Daniel Cameron, Republican, ran and lost for governor in Kentucky. Both races were decided by margins smaller than Michigan and Pennsylvania were in the 2020.
Yeah.
They both conceded the night of and wished their victor, the one who defeated them, well on behalf of their state.
Yeah. And
That's what needs to happen. And in the Virginia legislative races, some of the assembly seat races were decided by dozens of votes.
Yeah.
Recounts were held. Every single close election was recounted, scrutinized, and both sides accepted the outcome. These are positive signs of people understanding how elections work, and trust me, there was no absence of ardor or money or passion in the Virginia legislative races. Those were tightly, hard-fought races with lots of consequences. And everyone accepted, though they were very close. These are positive signs that outside of the Trump-influenced world, Americans involved in politics understand what is most important and live within those requirements.
Yeah. Well, I think those of us who work at the McCain Institute and, obviously are very proud of his legacy, one of the things that we're most proud of is the famous concession speech he made, and how gracious he was and how he reminded Americans of what it means to be American. And that is to say, if you're a loser, don't be a sore loser, rise to the occasion.
And even before that, I mean, during the campaign, his courage to speak the truth to his own supporters, that famous
About
moment in
Barack
that town
Obama.
hall.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
I mean, that is,
I think we have that pinned on our website.
that is
our
one of the,
social media.
that's in the best American tradition. The courage, it's easy to tell your supporters what they want to hear.
Right.
And there are tens of millions of Americans who are good Americans who voted for President Trump in 2020 and are sincerely disappointed.
Right.
And instead of the candidates and his support and others in his circle having the respect for them to tell them the truth,
Yeah.
they are targeting them
Continuing to
for
lie.
grift.
Yeah.
I mean, they're
Right.
raising money off of them. They're asking them to send $25 of their Social Security checks to line their pockets still to this day.
And I covered Senator McCain in the Senate for
Yes.
years. And I don't want to gloss over this. He cared a lot. He could get very angry
Oh, yes.
about issues
Oh, yes.
and things he was either
I worked in
winning
the Senate
and losing.
across the aisle from him, yes.
And I was yelled at by Senator McCain for asking what he thought were stupid, impertinent questions. He would get in my face.
Yeah.
He cared about
Yeah.
politics.
Yes.
He was not neutral.
No. Yeah.
He was not emotionally
It was not a
disconnected.
game.
It was not, all of that can exist. You don't hand over your passion by accepting an election result. You don't stop believing in America by conceding.
Right.
It doesn't make you a weakling.
Yeah.
It makes you stronger, actually.
Okay, so
Yeah, I
these
just wanted to
are
make that
great
one.
points. Thank you, and we love it when you say nice things about John McCain. One of the things that we did here, because at the McCain Institute we have a big global democracy program focused on frontline democracies: Ukraine, Republic of Georgia, Taiwan, others. We also do domestic democracy. Since 2018, the senator was actually still alive, and we decided we needed to do something here in our own front yard, if you will. We have a task force looking at disinformation, misinformation, truth. And we, as part of that effort, we conducted a poll of youth in Arizona. And we found, this was last spring, I believe, we found that 50% of the young Arizona voters either did not believe that the 2022 midterm election results were legitimate, or they thought they were not sure. So again, more than half of the young voters distrust in the election outcome. How do we combat that?
So I work a lot in the disinformation space, and the way that lies have been so resilient and persist to this day, lies that have been were debunked within hours on election night are still coming out about suitcases of ballots and Venezuelan dictators and Italian satellites and German servers and conspiracies of 1 million people, and somehow nobody is talking. Yeah. So disinformation is incredibly resilient, and we know that we're going to see even more of it in 2024 than 2020. Not only are the domestic actors who want to spread disinformation better organized and better funded than ever before, not only do they have a major presidential candidate still spreading those lies, but our foreign adversaries are highly incentivized. And they're highly incentivized. Russia in particular might be highly incentivized to get a particular candidate to win, but many of them are incentivized. China, North Korea, Iran, who we know have interfered with elections in the past as recently as 2022, they're incentivized to just get us divided, to just get us all doubting that democracy can work as a form of government, get us weak from inside so we're less likely to be able to act to support other worldwide democracies. This is a very clear goal of theirs, and they are going to be involved. And one of the really difficult things for us as a democracy is those that are trying to support democracy have to convince people of an objective truth, some facts that we can all agree upon. And the people who spread disinformation don't necessarily have to convince you of the lie. They just have to convince you that nothing is true. And that is something we're seeing consistently and is reflected in that poll that you just mentioned. One very important strategy I think that we're going to want to keep an eye on for 2024 that falls within my realm is voters can inoculate themselves against disinformation in one very important way. Disinformation works best when there's little chance to mitigate or to recover or to spread the accurate information after. So election day in particular is going to be a very difficult day for disinformation. It's going to be spreading. We could see some really repulsive disinformation being spread, designed to get people to either not vote or vote for someone else or to doubt the results. But if you vote early or by mail, vote early in person if you want, vote by mail if you want, vote on election day if you want. But the more we spread voting out over a series of days and a series of modes, the more resilient we will be against that disinformation. As soon as you've cast your ballot, you are immune to disinformation around the election. Now, you might still be susceptible to disinformation about what the outcome was, but what the actual ballots are and whether you vote, you'll be immune to it.
And the good news is we have a tremendous amount of energy focused on voter participation now. 2016 was not a high participation presidential election. 2018 set a record for midterm election turnout, highest in 100 years. The 2020 election, as we've described, the highest ever. 2022, nearly as high as 2018. So we have 3 election cycles in a row of very high voter participation. There is a lot of energy in this space. So people have doubts, but they're still participating. And part of the broader conversation is, here's how it works. Here is how you access it. And I know at the county level and at state level, those who are in this space are trying to be more active than they have ever been on being more visible, being more accessible, being more explanatory. Typically, these folks, election administrators, secretaries of state, kind of stuck to their knitting. Quietly, to use a Washington term, they didn't have a comms shop.
Yes.
There's no set of
They were
comms
regular people.
handling their communication strategies. They never had to do that.
You mean the secretaries of state?
Secretaries of state
officials, sure,
or the county clerks
They're
or things like
officials.
that. Right. And they kind of gravitated toward those jobs for that reason. They weren't trying to advance you don't go from Secretary of State to governor. Maybe you can, but it's not the typical stepping stone. So they wanted to do this work, and they never thought about the public-facing part of it. Well, now they do. But they're playing catch-up, way behind, because you can't chase a lie as effectively with the truth as you'd like to. You just can't. That's been true since the dawn of man. You can't chase a lie as fast as you want to with the truth. You just have to keep doing it again and again and again. And they're moving in this direction.
Can I add one more positive about how we're going to push back on this? the media is a lot better educated. I mean, Major is probably shocked at how much he knows about election administration now compared to where he was maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I work closely with CBS, but if you look at other media out there, the Washington Post and New York Times have democracy desks, people who are just devoted to these issues. The Arizona Republic has reporters who are and other reporters outside in other media venues in Arizona. Arizona is a great example of this, where these reporters just really dug into the details about how elections are run, and now they understand that when someone says, "Oh, someone just printed up ballots and they returned them," that can't happen and why that can't happen.
Right.
That someone just took all these mail ballots and returned them for other voters, that didn't happen and why that can't happen. That's so essential that we have this educated media environment right now that I think will be really helpful going into 2024 and beyond.
So I feel like there are so many questions to ask. Obviously, we have one candidate on the Republican side who right now looks poised to be on the ballot. We'll find out who is still peddling the big lie. And others, really only one pushing back super forcefully, which is the former governor of New Jersey, and Chris Christie. So I think, one thing we have to hope is that somewhere along the line, the big lie will be debunked, but we will be watching for that and waiting for your next book to show us perhaps how that happened. In the meantime, I think what we've heard today is that people need to make sure that they don't become apathetic, because that's actually worse than fighting with one another. We've seen that happen in the Russian context, where the people become apathetic because they're fed so many lies. There's actually a really good book about that I could also recommend, which now I'm going to forget the title, but Peter Pomerantsev wrote the book, which is "Everything is True and Nothing is True and Everything is Possible." If nothing is true, everything is possible for someone like Putin. So I think we want to make sure that America does not become apathetic. We want to make sure that people register. We want to make sure that people volunteer. And at some point, we want to make sure there's a ticker tape parade for all these people who really improved our democracy.
I think they'd be happy if they were just left alone and not hounded and followed from their place of work and photographed and receiving email threats and others. And a key point you just made that I'd love to reinforce, anyone listening, anyone you know, if you have any questions about this or you just want to support democracy, volunteer to be a poll worker.
Right.
I mean, every place has a need.
Yeah.
And even if you haven't done it before, you will learn all of the processes and checks and balances that make fraud so rare, that make it very hard for anyone to commit fraud and make it almost certain that they will be caught if they try. It's remarkable how poll workers, once they start working, become repeat poll workers. And then also become evangelists for the democratic process.
It's a great way to build community, build trust in your community. So on that note, I want to say thank you so much to Major Garrett and David Becker for being our fantastic experts. I would like to draw your attention to the McCaininstitute.org website, our social media as well, for upcoming authors and insights. I hope you come back in the near future in order to talk about your next book. And with that, I want to say thank you very much for your time and attention.